Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And we have a really interesting discussion today about the future of energy. I know that I've been getting a lot of questions from listeners about their mineral rights and their royalties and worried that we're going to stop producing oil and gas in the next few years. And so maybe they should sell it while it's still worth something. And so I think this is an important topic to understand the current energy mix, what that might look like in the future. What is the future for oil and gas? How long are we likely to keep using it? And how that could relate and tie back to all of our minerals and royalties. But this is something that is hard to really figure out exactly what's going to happen. Obviously, we don't have a crystal ball, but we've pulled a lot of the data that's available and want to talk through that. And then if you have a question about the energy future and what it might look like, or if you think we're wrong, feel free to post in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you have any alternate data that might support different ways of thinking, because we're all about having an informed discussion on this show. And I think that that is the most important part when it comes to the energy transition, Justin, is that we don't just fall prey to the dogma that's out there, and we actually do our own research and we figure out what we think is going to happen on our own based on the available data.
You said it, man. And there's lots of data out there, but it's a story of both history and what could be likely in the future, and it's subject to change. So we'll see how this story plays out. But Matt, I think you did a great job putting together what the landscape looks like today.
Thanks. Yeah, and this comes from a presentation that I gave last week. And so I thought I'd share it with you so that you'd be able to digest this information. And again, we can have an informed discussion. We can have these types of conversations with our friends, with our family, with our neighbors about the facts and the realities around energy, because the reality today is that there is a lot of misinformation out there. And I think it has the potential to cause a lot of human suffering if we're not careful. And we'll talk through why I think that's the case. Justin, let's go ahead and dive in. And I'm going to highlight a few visuals here as we go through. And so if you're listening to this on the podcast, be sure to check out the accompanying YouTube video, because we have all of the charts and graphs and information that we're going to be talking about for you to follow along and see what we're talking about as we're going through this.
Okay, Matt, so let's talk about the history of energy use to kind of set the stage for what brings us to today. And again, if you're not watching the YouTube video, there's some really wonderful visuals that go along with this. Early humans used biomass energy, and that's wood for cooking, heating, and light, relatively low density in form of energy. And it means it takes up a lot of space to store and transport. So when we got to the point of coal, this allowed for the development of new technologies such as steam engine, internal combustion engines, leading to massive increase in energy consumption and also an increase in the amount of work that humans could do because of the new power available to them. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of oil, which led to dramatic improvements in human well-being and life expectancy. The latter half of the 20th century saw the rise of nuclear energy, which produces an incredible amount of power for a small amount of fuel. Past 200 years, we've consistently advanced from low energy density fuels like biomass to increasingly more dense forms of energies like oil and natural gas, nuclear power being the highest. Renewable energy sources are seen as relatively clean and sustainable. Despite its potential, renewable energy still faces practical challenges: less energy dense, more expensive, and less reliable. Considering mining, transportation, and manufacturing, they're only marginally better from an environmental impact standpoint. These steps in the life cycle of renewables have an environmental impact. And so, Matt, really the story has been just moving to more dense types of energy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's the theme, is that we've always gone from low energy density to higher energy density. And we'll link in the show notes to the episode that we talked about this in a lot more detail. But to your point, Justin, it's really interesting that over that past, say, 20 to 30 years, when we've really focused on wind and solar, that has reversed. And so for the first time in recorded human history, we're moving to lower energy density sources of energy, which seems really counterintuitive.
You said it, man. And to the point of discussing, life expectancy and those kinds of things, we've got another chart here that kind of dives into the data. And then in the 1800s, the life expectancy was around 30 years old. We're now living into our 70s and 80s. Per capita GDP has also increased exponentially. And on the downside, so have CO2 emissions, which is what this chart here shows. Cost-effective energy, affordable, reliable, versatile, scalable energy is essential to human flourishing because it gives us the ability to use machines and to become more productive and prosperous. Thanks to today's unprecedented availability of cost-effective energy, mostly from fossil fuel, the world has never been a better place for human life. Life expectancy and income have been skyrocketing, with extreme poverty plummeting from 42% in 1980 to less than 10% today. And so, Matt, it really just sings to the testament that availability of energy at a cheap price really allows human life to flourish.
That's right. And I think the important thing to think about is the fact that throughout this time period, really from the 1800s till today, we've used an increasing amount of energy. And as a result, we've seen life expectancy go up. We've seen world GDP go up. That means standard of living is going up. World population has also gone up significantly as a result of that longer life expectancy. And we do have to manage, and really the focus of this energy transition is around CO2 emissions and managing CO2. So it has gone up, but at the same rate, there's actually some interesting charts at energytalkingpoints.com. So shout out to Alex Epstein for these 4 charts, which were taken from that website. And he talks a little bit there about how the number of humans that have died from climate-related events has actually dropped significantly. So I think when we hear about the headlines in the news, it's climate catastrophe, CO2 emissions have increased significantly. And the thing is, though, if you look at this on a geologic time scale, so we're looking at this over we're basically recorded human history the last 2,000 years. If you look at it over millions of years, we're actually at a low point in CO2. So that's an interesting thing to take away as well. So when we talk about the current energy landscape, I think it is important to talk about what percentage of the current world population has access to all of the things that we enjoy in the developed world. And the interesting fact that despite the increase in energy availability, we still have only 71.3%, at least as of 2022, with access to clean cooking facilities. And why is this important? It's because 2.3 billion people today lack access to that clean cooking. And instead, what they're doing is they're burning wood or animal dung, kerosene or coal as their primary cooking fuel, and they're breathing in that smoke. And that results in around 3.7 million premature deaths per year. And I don't know the exact numbers. We'll have to look, and maybe we can find something to link in the notes below as to how many people died during the COVID pandemic. And I've got to think the totality of the pandemic is probably somewhere near that. But if you think about we have a pandemic of lack of access to clean cooking, and it's resulting each year in 3.7 million people dying because of that. So when we talk about inflationary pressures and things like that in the developing world, sub-Saharan Africa, which I've highlighted here, you can see the world population 71.3, but in some parts of the world, like sub-Saharan Africa, only 20% of the population has access to clean cooking. And that means that there are some countries that there are millions of people that would give anything to have access to be able to cook with electricity or with the natural gas, and things like that would make a huge improvement in their quality of life. And so these are things that we don't really hear about in the news. And so I think it's really important to highlight when we talk about energy poverty, what we mean is access to basic necessities for our current standard of living in the developed world. And that's clean cooking and then electricity. So to that point, when you look at the share of the world population with access to electricity, we're doing better, but it really depends on where you are. So while the latest data from the IEA, which is what this is taken from as of 2022, around 90.2% of the world population had access to electricity. In 2022, the world population was just under 8 billion. So this means that there's more than 780 million people that still lack access to electricity. And this is even more prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa again. And so I've highlighted a few of those countries. just to show kind of the growth from where they were. And we made amazing strides in the last 20 years in lifting up those people to give them more access to electricity, but there's still a long way to go, especially if you're living somewhere like Chad, which less than 10% of the population that has access to electricity. Nigeria, which is a very energy rich country, is the highest there. So I think that's important to note, is they have natural gas and oil reserves. And you can see they're at the top of the list. And there's no coincidence that that is the case. So that is why I think having access to affordable and reliable energy is so important for humans to flourish. Again, it's really a critical that we continue to develop those sources of electricity and energy and allow everybody to have access to those, not just us. And, that means allowing them to access the most affordable way to get there, because it's going to have a significant impact on their quality of life. So, Justin, do you want to talk through a couple of the trends that we're seeing around the energy transitions? And we can talk through maybe whether these are likely to play out as presented, or maybe there are some gaps in the forecast.
You said it, man. Yeah. And as everybody knows, the renewables have been all the talk in the last few years. And as we kind of talked about in the history of energy usage, it really means looking at going back to less dense forms of energies. So with that focus on renewables, it'd be nice to know how things could play out in our race to electrify everything. So the charts we're looking at here are taken from JP Morgan's latest energy report, which is titled ElectroVision. According to this report, the predominant vision for the future involves electrifying of everything powered by solar, wind, transmission, and distributed energy storage. The vision primarily relies upon the greater efficiency of electric motors and heat pumps versus their fossil fuel counterparts. While the grid is getting greener, electrification is advancing at a much slower pace for reasons related to chemistry, physics, cost, politics, and human behavior. The report presents a common view of the future as it relates to energy transition and working towards a lower carbon future, particularly in the US and other developed countries. And Matt, I found these charts to be really interesting. They're forecasting a major decrease in fossil fuel consumption in the US while having major strides up in electricity generation and then the generation of electricity through wind and solar, which would be great in a wonderful world, but it's kind of not quite played out that way, Matt. We're really still using fossil fuels as that stopgap to get us where we're going.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that this report is assuming things that are, really science fiction at this point. So assuming widespread, cost-effective, accessible energy storage that would be tied to the grid, so that if you did build out the wind and solar electricity generation and almost multiplied it by 6 times, like they're showing here in this ElectroVision scenario, then possibly you could get away with that level of wind and solar if you had a reliable energy storage and backup solution. Unfortunately, that is not the case. It would take trillions of dollars to get there. And so it's not, feasible at this point in time unless there's some step change in technology that we haven't developed yet. So when you think about today, the realities of physics, the realities of energy density, in order to get to a point where we have a lower carbon future in terms of emissions, wind and solar cannot play the primary role there because they need to have a reliable backup. And right now, that reliable backup and baseload power is natural gas. And so for every wind and solar power plant that you build, you have to build an equal sized natural gas power plant to back it up when the wind isn't blowing or when the sun isn't shining. And so that makes it almost twice the cost when you look at the reality of needing to keep the lights on. It sounds good on paper if you have wind and solar, but then what happens at night, especially if everybody's charging their electric vehicles like this is talking about. And I think the way that this report is really highlighting that we get to a decreased demand for fossil fuels is by reducing the demand in the transportation sector. And that means electrifying cars and trucks and everything like that. So, that sounds good on paper, but again, you have to have a reliable and affordable source of electricity in order to power everything if it is electrified. So I think that's important. And the question that always comes to my mind, Justin, is, okay, so wouldn't it be nice if we knew how that could play out? What if we did go down this path and continue to build out the majority of the grid with renewables. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a case study? And in fact, I think we actually do have one in the case of Germany. And do you want to talk about that?
Yep, absolutely, Matt. Yeah, so Germany presents a really interesting picture to look at. And with the focus on renewables, the question becomes, like you said, Matt, what could this look like? And the chart that we're showing here shows an annual net share of electricity generation from renewables from 1990 to today. The percent of electricity generation in Germany has grown by more than 15 times over this time period. And while Germany still relies heavily on other sources of energy in terms of their total final energy consumption, for example, transportation, renewables still represent a significantly higher percentage of their overall energy mix. The renewable shares of total energy consumption in Germany on a percentage basis is roughly 1.6 times higher than the US. So I think it represents a good proxy of where we seem to be headed, Matt. And, if looking at the charts that JP Morgan put out, this seems to be the idea that we're going to head towards using renewables as a much higher percentage of the mix.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
The real question here, Matt, is how's that worked out for Germany? And unfortunately, it hasn't worked particularly well. Cost of electricity for the average household in Germany has risen by around 3 times since 2000. There are several factors that play into this. One of which is after a Fukushima nuclear accident in 2011, Germany ordered an immediate shutdown of 8 of the 17 countries operating nuclear reactors and announced a plan to completely phase out nuclear power. In 2011, nuclear power had accounted for about a quarter of the electricity produced in Germany. And as of 2023, they've completely phased out nuclear. And since 2006, they've had to replace more than 167 terawatt hours on an annual basis that have been produced by nuclear power. And Matt, nuclear power really seems to be the thing that we're not talking about. And this chart kind of speaks to that. Without that in the mix, it can be kind of a sad story of the transition and how quickly we can do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think the people of Germany have really voted against these policies. In recent times, we've seen a change, and the result of them, not building out natural gas and shutting down nuclear, building wind and solar. When the Nord Stream pipeline stopped flowing gas because of the sabotage that occurred and the resulting sanctions against Russia because of the invasion of Ukraine, they've had to import LNG largely from the US. We've actually helped with a lot of that, but then also they've had to go and restart a bunch of coal-fired power plants. And so, because of they've shut down that baseload and reliable nuclear power that had represented a quarter of their grid back in 2011, which isn't that long ago, it seems like they're really going backwards in time. And in fact, they're sort of deindustrializing their country. It used to be the manufacturing hub of Europe, and that is no longer the case because it's too expensive to produce goods in Germany just because of the high electricity prices.
You said it, man. And nuclear power is really something that can be underestimated. And we talked about Germany decommissioning their nuclear reactors, but it seems that we may be headed into a nuclear renaissance. Between 2024 and 2026, an additional 29 gigawatts of nuclear capacity is expected to come online globally, more than half of them in China and India, with new plants starting commercial operation in various regions, as well as the French nuclear recovery and expected restarts in Japan. The IEA forecasts global nuclear generation to be 10% higher in 2026 compared to what it was in 2023. In 2022 and 2023, many countries placed the phasing in or expansion of nuclear power at the center of their strategies to reach climate policy objectives, sparking a significant revival of global interest in nuclear energy. The IEA's updated net zero roadmap shows nuclear energy more than doubling by 2050, complementing renewable deployment and easing the pressure on critical mineral supply. We produced around 2,700 terawatt hours in nuclear power generation in 2023. So if we more than double this would grow to 5,400 terawatt hours by 2050, Matt. And that would make a huge impact to our ability to have that powered in the event the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think the real interesting thing is if you think about this on a percentage basis, from that first slide that we showed, nuclear power only represents a small percentage of the total primary energy. And so if we're going to double it, that's great. But I think in order to get to a point where you're really taking the emissions out of the energy generation equation, nuclear power has got to play a lot larger role than they're forecasting today. And even the modest growth that they are forecasting over the next three years is great. In countries like China and India that don't have the regulatory hurdles to build new nuclear reactors like we do here in the US and some other countries. And there's amazing technology that's coming up that is making it safer to produce energy via nuclear power. And when we talk about energy density, I think this is really important to think about because nuclear power has as much energy as these amounts of natural gas, oil, and coal. And if you talk about this in like commonly used units, like 1,000 cubic feet of gas, so an MCF, and we talk about the price of gas is right around $2 per MCF right now. And that's what we see on our royalty checks. So that's 17 MCF of gas in one uranium fuel pellet, which is the size of your fingertip. And that's also equivalent to 3.5 barrels of oil or 1 ton of coal. So, Justin, when you talk about a nuclear power plant, those fuel rods are quite large. They have multiple fuel rods in each reactor that can produce a tremendous amount of energy that we go to great lengths to extract the natural gas, the oil, the coal. And now, obviously, the uranium has to be mined. It has to be processed and refined in order to get it into a fuel pellet. So, that said, though, the amount of energy that can be produced from that, and of course, that is not producing carbon emissions. If that is a real concern, if we want to reduce our carbon emissions, but still have affordable and reliable energy, in my mind, nuclear power has to play a large role. And to that point, there's a newsletter on Substack called Doomberg that I subscribe to. And this quote is taken from a recent newsletter that was titled Malthusian Malarkey. And it says, "We often say that if nuclear energy were discovered today, it would be heralded as planet-saving technology to be invested in and propagated at warp speed. An intelligent global energy policy with nuclear power as a foundation can provide abundance to all humanity with minimal impact on the environment. Without hyperbole, there is no path to a decarbonized economy that avoids mass starvation and economic collapse without nuclear power, and the hardest opponents of this technology know it." So, Justin, I think that quote really summarizes nicely the role that nuclear power can and really has to play in a path to decarbonization that does not result in human suffering. And I believe that those advancements in nuclear reactor technology, when we talk about small modular reactors that are safer to operate, that can be built quicker, more cost effectively, in my mind, I think that is the future. And we have other things like nuclear fusion that are going to come up and hopefully play a role if we can figure out the technology and make it affordable. But in the meantime, we have nuclear technology today. We can build those nuclear reactors. We just need the political will really to go ahead and do it. And then you can do things like have wind and solar, natural gas fired power plants, and have a relatively clean energy future, especially when you take into account the focus on carbon capture, which seems to be a big buzz right now as well.
You said it, man. And there's some trends that we're seeing when it comes to the goal of reaching net zero carbon emissions. Within heavy industry and the oil and gas industry, carbon capture and sequestration has been a big focus. CCS is the process of capturing CO2 from the atmosphere or before it reaches the atmosphere and injecting it underground or capturing it using biological methods. This includes technologies like direct air capture, which Oxy and other companies are piloting to capture CO2 at the source, like a coal-fired power plant. And one opportunity that carbon capture presents is in enhanced oil recovery. It's not a popular opinion because it still involves the production and usage of fossil fuels, but it could play an important role in the future. EOR is the process of injecting fluids like CO2 into the reservoir to increase production. With CCS, there are actually a lot of things that need to happen before it becomes more widespread. One issue is the ownership of the pore space and how companies would need to lease the pore space for CO2 storage. States like Texas have been working on legislation to address uncertainties around ownership of that pore space where CO2 would be stored and seek primacy for permitting of Class 6 CO2 storage wells.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That is the big area that we're still trying to figure it out. So if you think about, well, tomorrow we're going to be capturing all the carbon and sequestering underground, we're just at the very beginning stages of this because of the legislative framework, the legal framework that needs to be set up to figure out who owns what, who needs to be paid the royalty or the bonus to lease that space. And in most cases, the surface estate has been determined to own the pore space. And so that means the mineral owners do not own the pore space, which seems kind of counterintuitive, Justin, when we think about, the fact that we own the oil and gas in that pore space, if there's oil and gas there. But in cases where it's in a deep aquifer, if it's an area where there's no oil and gas, there's no minerals within that pore space, and that's where they're looking to store the CO2, that's been determined that the surface owner will need to be contacted and responsible for that. And that can present some potential problems. This image that we show here, which is taken from the EPA's website, shows some different ways that CO2 can be sequestered. And if you think about it, if you're having to sequester the CO2 into a geological formation, one of the requirements in order to allow the companies to get the tax credits is they're sort of having to certify that carbon is never going to be released again. And that means that you're not going to be able to drill through those formations where that CO2 is being stored. So hopefully this means that it's going to be stored in a very deep underground formation that has no oil and gas potential. So you could still develop the minerals above that CO2 reservoir, basically without disturbing it. If that is determined to not be the case, there could be an issue with developing oil and gas reserves that are basically trapped because of the CO2 sequestration that's occurred, and they don't want the CO2 to get out. So that's a big issue that we're trying to work through and trying to figure out where's the best place to store this stuff that allows for future development of oil and gas. So I know that'll be a big focus for people that own minerals and royalties. So Justin, once you do capture that, if you're going to store it underground, there are only certain places that maybe are cost effective in terms of, that it's the right depth, it's not too deep, or the type of geology and type of formation is suitable for storage. And so those potential storage areas are in green. This Great Plains Institute has identified some potential carbon and hydrogen hubs, which is circled in those white dashed lines. And the concept of those hubs is that you'd have coordination between facilities, and this would enable economies of scale that would spur development of shared transportation and storage infrastructure. So, for example, in the DJ Basin, which is in southeast Wyoming and in northeast Colorado, on that Wyoming side, a company called Tallgrass Energy is working on a project to convert its Trailblazer natural gas pipeline to CO2 service. And they're expecting that pipeline would act as a backbone of regional CO2 transportation located in that area near Laramie County. And so basically the thought process is that they would capture and sequester 10 million tons of CO2 per year from industry in northwest Nebraska, in Colorado and Wyoming, and they could use that area to inject it into these deep saline aquifers that can be cost effective and utilized to lock up that CO2 forever. Let's take it out of the smokestacks of the power plants and inject it underground. And so you could see here where they have the CO2 generation, from industry that way, or it could be from direct air capture and things like that. So yeah, interesting potential there, but really a long way to go, I think, Justin, is the moral of the story.
You said it, man. And talking about the reality of energy today, one of the things we mentioned in the history is that we've consistently gone to more dense forms of energy throughout our history. And as we've talked about, nuclear is really the option that offers the most dense solution. And so, Matt, let's talk about what does the energy reality look like and what is the future going to hold?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And again, we don't have a crystal ball. And I think the big question that always comes up when it comes to energy is how many years of fossil fuel reserves do we have left? We're producing more and more. We need that energy to ensure that humans are allowed to flourish, because one of the most energy dense, the most affordable and reliable way that we generate energy is through fossil fuels. And if you look at the years left of fossil fuel reserves, again, this is from the Statistical Review of Energy from 2023, which was the last year that was produced, is they're forecasting 139 years left of coal, 57 years left with oil, and 49 years left with gas. And that is based on the remaining reserves that companies are stating, and then current consumption levels. And if you were to divide those two together, that's how many years you would be left with at the current rate of consumption. And so the thing to keep in mind when we talk about reserves, that is by definition, resources that are economic to develop at current prices. As we get further down the road, if there's less of a commodity, as we've shown supply and demand, the price will go up. And that would mean that there are more reserves that are economic to produce. So this is sort of like a balancing act. Even though you start to whittle down and produce the oil and the gas, the chart keeps getting longer as the prices go up because companies drill and to produce that oil and gas at a profit. And so that is an interesting concept with reserves. And so this is a sort of a technical term. But anyway, the thing that you always need to think about is in the prevailing sentiment for a long time had been that we were going to hit peak oil, right? And you hear this term peak oil. And they were talking in the 1980s that we were at peak oil and, we were going to continue to not find any more and it would go down and down and down. But in fact, the opposite has happened. And oil and gas reserve forecasts have doubled since 1980 to the point of where you had almost 3x the amount of natural gas reserves versus where we were in 1980. And then same thing with oil. We were about almost 3x where we were in 1980 in terms of the current reserves. And right before the shale revolution in the late 2000s, before we hit that kind of 2010 time period when we really started to unlock the horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, they thought we were in the US, not going to have a ton of oil and gas potential. We're going to continue to need to import. In fact, that script was flipped and we went to becoming the largest producer of oil and gas in the world. So I think the moral of the story here is we continue to discover new oil and gas reserves. And those forecasts have consistently gone up over time as we unlock new technology. We find new areas where oil and gas is located that we didn't know about before. And this doesn't even take into account enhanced oil recovery. So an important thing to think about with oil and gas production is we're only extracting a small percentage of the oil and gas that's in the reservoir, or maybe up to 10% with some of these shale formations. So that means 90% of the oil and gas is still locked underground. And if we can find a way using technologies like enhanced oil recovery to extract more oil and gas from the reservoirs that we know it's there. So this doesn't even account for the exploration of new areas that we didn't know about before. With these shale reservoirs, we know the oil and gas is there. It's just that we can't get at it affordably with current technologies. So there's a huge opportunity there. And I'm sure with some innovation that will occur in the industry, we'll continue to see ways to more efficiently, more effectively extract that oil and gas. So I think a pretty good opportunity there that we don't really hear about too much, Justin.
You said it, Matt. Yeah. So it's interesting to see how that kind of plays. And as you said, Matt, it continues to double year over year, the reservoirs that we're aware of. And let's talk about what does the landscape look like for the usage of oil and natural gas for the future.
Yeah. So the important thing here to take away from this chart, the IEA is forecasting that by 2050, we'll be using the same amount of oil and natural gas as we're using today. And then you'll see the majority of the growth coming from wind and solar and other renewables. So that would be things like hydroelectric power, geothermal, and things like that. So that's what we are hearing in the news is there's new wind and solar being developed. That is the future. And if that are to be the case, as is projected here, we would still need at least as much oil and natural gas as we're using today. And what that means when you talk about drilling, it doesn't mean that we just can produce that from existing wells. With wells that decline very rapidly, like the shale wells that we're drilling primarily, you have to keep drilling new wells in order to maintain production levels flat. So what this means is that at current production levels, we're going to require significant investment into the future into drilling new wells. And so if you have mineral rights, this means there will be continued opportunity for leasing and drilling. If you're in an area where there is nearby activity, the geology will support drilling a new well and it's economic to do so. It's just maybe a matter of time before they get to your property and actually drill a well. Now, there's some areas that maybe there'll never be oil and gas production. All mineral rights are not created equal. Geology is different in different places, but I think the important thing to think about, if you own mineral rights or maybe you've recently inherited mineral rights and you're wondering what does the future hold, I think this is an important chart to think about. And, we're not going away from using fossil fuels by 2030, this net zero by 2030 concept or net zero by 2050. The way that we would get to net zero is not by stopping the use of oil and natural gas. It's by ramping up nuclear power generation, wind and solar with some energy storage, and with carbon capture and sequestration and offsetting the emissions. And so it would be net zero. It doesn't mean it's zero emissions. It means that the net result is they're investing in things that are sequestering carbon, maybe reforesting, trees, carbon capture and sequestration, and things that are going to offset the emissions from the use of oil and gas, not that we're going to stop using it. So I think that is something that you do not hear enough of. And the important thing to think about when we talk about energy poverty, I think the most important thing is that we have the population continuing to grow. There's 8 billion people that, close to 8 billion people that live on the planet today. Most of those people do not enjoy access to affordable, reliable energy like we do in the developed world. They are trying to get there, and we need to support that and allow them to get to that level, and so that we can eliminate human suffering. And that is through premature deaths from cooking with wood and dung and other dirty sources of cooking fuels, and then also allowing them to have access to electricity. That'll continue to extend our life expectancies, continue to expand the increase in GDP and allow those people to flourish. So what the world holds in terms of energy, we don't know. Hopefully it's not this dystopian future, but the thing that we need to think about is that renewable energy, like wind shown here, and solar are important. They can play a big part, but they have to be backed up by nuclear power, by natural gas, and other reliable forms of baseload power. Otherwise, we're going to be going backwards in time, and we're going to be going backwards in terms of the reliability and affordability of electricity. We saw what happened in Germany. We don't want to repeat those same mistakes. And so despite the platitudes you might hear about in the news, physics is going to win at the end of the day. Over the medium and long term, the choices that make energy more expensive and less reliable are going to lose favor. They have to. I mean, I know that I personally am not going to vote for somebody whose policy decisions are causing my electricity bill to double, and for the lights to not be available to where I can't cool my home or charge my car or cook with the type of fuel source that I choose. Those things are going to not be acceptable in the future once people feel the pain. I think that while climate change is a global challenge, we have to find solutions. It can be done with technology. We've done it before. It is definitely not the greatest threat to human life. And I think if you were just to ask the 7 billion people with less access to affordable and reliable energy than we enjoy today, they would say the same thing. And just to recognize a couple of different resources we'll link to in the show notes and in the description below. There's a report by Liberty Energy called Bettering Human Lives, and I think it's a great read. Definitely check it out. It has some of the similar data that we've talked about here today. And another great resource is energytalkingpoints.com, which author Alex Epstein put together to try to provide a fact-based resource for debunking some of these potential myths around energy. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out, Justin. Hopefully we make smart policy decisions that will result in human flourishing and will to help minimize some of these issues we've talked about today. So hope this video has been useful. Again, check out more at mineralrightspodcast.com. And again, if you're listening to the audio version of this, check out the YouTube video. It has a wealth of additional information. And as always, we link to the resources we mentioned in this episode in the show notes at mineralrightspodcast.com. Thanks again, Justin.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.